The first of our speakers. So I'd like to introduce to you Professor Whittaker.
Some of these particular stresses are also bad for us because not only do they cause us to feel stress, but they also have an impact on our social support or our support networks. So a lot of these types of stresses can lead to you being more lonely than you were before, becoming socially isolated, or just having lower levels of support. So that's something else that we look at. When we measure stress and we look at effects on health, we also tend to look at social support and people's social networks and loneliness as well at the same time. So I told you this wasn't going to be positive stuff, it's kind of negative stuff. But the question is all stress bad? Because I think when people talk about stress, and particularly medics when they talk about stress, they think stress is really bad, has negative effects on the body if they actually believe that, or have looked at any of the evidence for that. And it's all bad, it's all negative. And actually that's not true, because if you think about it, you need to be able to respond to little stressful things in your life and then get over it and move on. You need to mobilise your energy to deal with things as they happen and then move on. So if you didn't have any stress response, there'd be a bit of a problem. And another area of research that I do that I'm not talking about today is looking at people who, when we put them in my lab, when we put them under a little stressful task, they don't seem to have a response. And they feel the same as anyone else that we stress out in the lab, but physically, we look at heart rate and blood pressure and a bunch of things, and they don't seem to have a response. And that's not good for your health either. So, stress isn't all bad, and a lot of that depends on the duration and severity of the stress. So we have what we'd call acute stress. So these are things like your daily hassles. So I don't know if your place of work is anything like mine, but basically if you don't get there before 8:15 in the morning, you cannot get a parking space. And you're driving around for hours and hours and hours, and of course you're paying for the privilege of this. So acute stress is daily hassles that you experience and then get over and move on. It's also short term. So when we look at students in our research, it's things like examinations or tests, and then there's also what I mentioned, the stress that we give people in my lab. Chronic stress, on the other hand, has a different effect, and it's those events that we were talking about a couple of slides ago. So the things that are more severe, things that are more enduring, like your caregiving or bereavement. And these different types of stress have different effects on the body, and that's why we can say that not all stress is bad. Because what we see is that acute stress, the short-term stress, can actually, if your body's working properly, have a bit of a mobilising effect, and then you recover, and you go back to where you were, and you've had a response that helps you deal with that event. But chronic stress leads to wear and tear, and that can mean that you eventually end up with diseases or being more prone to having diseases. So I've been involved in a study that was in Glasgow that actually started back in the 80s, and I got involved in probably in about 2004. They followed people up over time. They followed them up to see the social determinants of health. So what kind of factors in people's lives determine their health as they got older. And it was called the 2007 study because they followed them up until 2007. Except it took a bit longer, so it's actually 2009. But it was already called that, so they stuck with the name. And they followed them up in 3 groups. So as well as looking at ageing as the study went on, they were able to look between the different age groups to see age effects straight away rather than having to wait for them to age. And one of the things they did was took saliva samples and looked at people's ability to produce this little immunoglobulin.
How many do we have then?
How many? Oh, loads. It's always like 10 to the no. Lots. And we don't really know exactly the right number, but it's like any kind of blood test. I think there'll be a range that you'd want to have be somewhere within. And we collect it with these things called salivettes, and it's a bit like a dental swab, so when they give you that cotton wool thing, you stuff it up your gum. Well, with this, we ask them to gently chew on it for a minute or 2 and then pop it back in. We then spin it in a centrifuge, get rid of all the bits of their breakfast and whatever they might have had left, get the pure saliva out the bottom, and we look at the production of this immunoglobulin. And we'd also ask them about stress, and in one particular study, we'd ask them about caregiving stress. So we said, did they actually do any caregiving that wasn't just looking after their typically developing children? they can mention up to 4 people. And we asked lots of other things as well. How long did they spend caregiving a week and all that type of thing? What exactly did they do? But just looking at caregivers and non-caregivers, what we found was that people who were caregivers didn't produce as much of this antibody in their saliva, which you would think would then relate to not being quite as protected against your colds and your flus and all of the rest of it. But what you can see is that this was particularly the case, in fact, singularly the case in the older group. And the older group at the time in this study was 63. So if you add the fact that they were caregiving and older than the rest of the people in the study together, then you've got a double effect of stress and ageing, and it's even affecting just your ability to produce this particular part of the immune system. So how on earth is that happening? So we've talked about cortisol, our stress hormone, and we know that can actually be quite damaging to the immune system. It's a good thing if you're having a massive inflammatory reaction. That's why they give you cortisone, to try and bring that down, otherwise your immune system goes crazy, so that's why we produce cortisol. But on the other hand, it can also suppress your immune system when you actually want certain bits of it to be working. But there's another hormone, and it's this one called dehydroepiandrosterone, or we call it DHEA for obvious reasons. And this works in the opposite way, so I kind of think of it as the anti-cortisol. And it's immune enhancing. So it kind of does the opposite of everything cortisol does. So you want to have a nice amount of this DHEA to kind of balance out that system. However, the bad news is, as you get older, your cortisol, roughly, I mean, the research varies a bit on this, either goes up slightly, down slightly, but generally on average stays around the same. But unfortunately, your DHEA levels drop. And they actually start dropping around the age of 30. So if you're over 30, we're already kind of stuck. And by the time you're kind of what we'd call old in immune system terms, not generally, but that's 65, you can see you're down to about a third of what you had when you were in your 20s. So what we often look at is this ratio between the two hormones to get a picture or a snapshot of someone's health, and we relate that back to how stressed they are. So older people are going to have a higher ratio of cortisol to DHEA simply because they're producing less DHEA. What have we seen? We've seen that some of these stresses seem to affect your immune system, and therefore you'd expect that to roll on to affecting your health. And we've seen a bit of evidence that this is worse in older people. Now I'm going to skip through the next couple. Just to say, what can we do about it, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, is where you come in, and I think you'll be discussing this sort of thing later. In my department, which is a School of Sport, Exercise and Rehabilitation Sciences, one of the main things we try and do about it is get people to be more active. And we know that activity can have positive effects on immunity and also on psychological factors, as you can see there in the red. And there's been various studies on that, and we're trying to start one at the moment. So I won't go into detail. Just to say that it doesn't have to be that to solve all of these problems you're going to the gym. We think that you can be physically active in a lot of different ways, and one of the challenges is to think how to get people to do this, and I'm sure you'll have your own ideas about this, in a way that actually fits into their lives and isn't forcing everyone to go into a gym with lots of lycra-clad 18-year-olds, something that I also avoid like plague. And another thing that we think, as well as exercise, is trying to reduce some of those other factors. So ideally, we try and reduce stress, but that's quite a challenge. So what if we try and look at the other factors like social support? What if we try and reduce loneliness instead? And why don't we do that in a way that is increasing people's physical activity? So some of the studies that we're working on at the moment are to try and do that. I've also got a big European study called Panini, which the Italian partners in the study really liked, everyone else wasn't sure. And this is about physical activity and nutrition influences in ageing. So I think there's a lot of different ways we can tackle these problems. So hopefully, although it's fairly depressing data, particularly if you're ageing and feeling particularly stressed, I think there are lots of solutions. So at that point, I'm going to stop, and thank you for listening.